The shuttle descended through the ochre clouds with a trembling hum that resonated in the bones of everyone inside. Ethan Cole felt the vibration through his boots as he strapped himself in for landing, watching the cracked landscape of Vascore 4 emerge from the atmospheric haze. The planet looked dead long before the engines cooled. Hills of dust, scattered dunes of broken shale, and scattered white fragments that looked almost like stone but gleamed with the dull sheen of bone stretched across the horizon. The other cadets pressed closer to the window ports, whispering in fear. Ethan remained still, observing quietly. The instructors had warned the class that this final survival exam would push each species far beyond instinct, but even he had not expected a test site this barren. As the shuttle's landing struts slammed against the ground and dust erupted around them, one of the alien cadets, a slim, violet-skinned Narathi girl named Sira, clutched the straps with shaking hands. Her species relied heavily on atmospheric manipulators and nutrient injectors, none of which she had been allowed to bring. Beside her, a scaled Kraylock cadet hissed nervously, unused to any environment without volcanic heat. The doors opened with a hydraulic sigh, releasing a wave of scorching air into the cabin. The instructors stepped out first, their metallic uniforms reflecting the harsh light of the twin suns. The lead instructor, Commander Rethar, raised his voice so it echoed across the dunes. "This is Vascore 4, cadets. A planet stripped of resources by previous generations. No flora, no accessible metals, no water on the surface, no stable materials. You will survive here for 5 days." His tone held no sympathy, only cold authority. Another instructor, a tall Urelian woman with translucent skin, lifted a metal case and opened it with a click. Every cadet tensed, expecting rations or tools. Instead, she revealed absolutely nothing, an empty metal interior polished to a mirror sheen. She turned the box upside down to emphasize the point. "No tech," she said sharply. "No tools, no fire starters, no containers, no supports. Anything you build must be created from this planet alone." The Kraylock cadet protested with a deep growl, but the instructors ignored him. The rules were absolute. The moment the instructors boarded the shuttle again and the engines roared to life, a heavy silence dropped onto the group. Dust swirled around them as the shuttle lifted from the ground, leaving them alone in the suffocating heat. Every cadet scanned the horizon in disbelief. There was nothing. Not a single tree trunk, not a single pool of water, not even a boulder large enough to hide behind. Just cracked earth, crumbling ridges, and scattered fragments of something that had once lived and died long before any of them were born. Sira took a few steps forward, bending to inspect one of the fragments. Her fingers traced the bleached surface, and her breath caught. "Is this bone?" she whispered. The Kraylock cadet recoiled instinctively. His species considered contact with the remains of dead creatures to be taboo, a ritual reserved for priests. Ethan crouched beside her and lifted another fragment. It was smooth and hollow inside, shaped perfectly like the rib of a large quadruped. He rotated it under the sun, examining the edges. It wasn't just bone. It had been broken repeatedly. Some of the edges looked deliberately carved. That meant someone before them had already tried to rebuild something on this wasteland, or had died trying. The alien cadets fanned out, each one reacting to the landscape with growing panic. A broad-shouldered Avarian male attempted to dig into the soil with his claws, only to find the ground as solid as baked ceramic. A Zyran girl tried to activate an instinctive bioluminescent tool her species relied on for signaling, but without supporting equipment, the organ flickered uselessly. Every species had some evolutionary advantage that required equipment, metals, catalysts, or atmospheres that no longer existed here. Ethan had none of those advantages, yet because of that, he felt strangely calm. Human survival training had always emphasized one principle above everything: adapt to the environment, even if the environment offered nothing. He straightened slowly and looked across the dead world again. The first detail he noticed was the wind. It cut through the empty plains in steady patterns, pushing the dust in predictable arcs. That meant he could map airflow and find natural windbreaks. Then he saw the dunes of layered debris, small mounds formed not just of dust, but of discarded materials. He stepped closer and nudged a pile with his boot. Under the top layer of dirt lay shards of old polymer, metallic scraps too small to be useful for conventional tools, bits of broken equipment from past trials, and fossilized pieces of creatures that once roamed the planet before some unknown extinction. Trash, yes, but trash was raw potential. As the other cadets argued about where to find water or how to survive the heat, Ethan crouched again and sifted through the debris. Beneath the polymer flakes he found something smoother, curved, and surprisingly intact. The long spine of a creature, each vertebra still attached by dried tendons that had hardened into thin cord-like strands. He didn't smile outwardly, but a small spark of excitement flared inside him. Cord, structure, leverage. He rose and looked at the group, listening as panic built in their voices. The Avarian cadet complained loudly that the instructors had set them up to fail. Sierra insisted that someone must have miscalculated the difficulty. A third cadet had already curled into the shade of a broken ridge and refused to move. Ethan stepped away from them without announcing anything. He preferred silence when he worked. He scanned the terrain further and noticed faint depressions, circular, repeating patterns in the dust. At first glance they looked natural, but the longer he studied them, the more he recognized remnants of old shelters, collapsed long ago. He walked toward the nearest depression and ran his hand across the ground. Beneath a thin veneer of dust, he uncovered more bone fragments and brittle synthetic pieces, arranged like the skeleton of a makeshift hut. Whoever built this had tried to survive. That alone meant resources were hidden in the landscape, even if at first glance everything appeared hopeless. He crouched again and tapped two bone fragments together. The sound was crisp, resonant, promising durability. With enough force and the right shaping method, these could become tools. The shell-like remains scattered nearby were harder, capable of becoming cutting edges. Old ration packaging could become waterproof layers. The broken lens he had seen glinting in the sand could concentrate sunlight. A shelter could rise here. Tools could exist here. A system could function here. Civilization, even in primitive form, could begin again here. While the others remained frozen in fear, he already knew the truth. This planet was not empty. It was full of forgotten attempts, discarded failures, and raw materials waiting for a mind stubborn enough to shape them. He looked up at the pale sky with the unchanging determination that had carried him through every challenge in the academy. If the instructors wanted to see what a human could build from nothing, he would show them. On Vascore 4, nothing simply meant unnoticed potential, and he intended to notice everything. Ethan moved steadily across the scorched plain, leaving behind the cluster of terrified cadets who still argued over the hopelessness of their situation. The air rippled with heat rising from the ground, making the horizon bend and shimmer as though the planet itself refused to hold a stable shape. His boots crunched softly over dust and brittle fragments as he followed the faint trail of debris that had caught his interest earlier. With every step he found more pieces that confirmed his suspicion. This region had once been the site of multiple desperate attempts at survival. To him, that meant opportunity. He knelt near a cluster of long, narrow bones half buried in the soil, brushing away the sand until the shapes became clearer. These bones were not random scatterings. They were arranged in a way that hinted at deliberate placement, almost like the framing of a collapsed structure. He picked one up and weighed it in his hand, feeling the rigid density and noticing a slight curve that promised flexibility under pressure, but strength under tension. It reminded him of how humans shaped primitive bows centuries ago, long before alloys and polymers existed. He examined it closely, turning it in the sunlight, and felt a quiet certainty form in his mind. This was not just material. This was the beginning of a tool. Nearby, A broken shell-like plate rested in the sand, half hidden beneath a ridge. He lifted it and inspected the edge. The texture was rough but strong, capable of cutting softer materials if sharpened properly. He imagined using bone as a handle and the shell as a blade, binding them with strands of sinew dried by the unrelenting heat of Vascore 4. It was crude, but crude solutions had saved countless explorers in human history. He knew that if he could fashion even a simple cutting tool, everything else would follow. He continued gathering materials, creating small piles at his feet. A rib-like structure could become a brace. A smooth vertebra could become part of a joint. Shards of broken synthetic fragments from past failed equipment could serve as shims, wedges, or fire reflectors. He worked methodically, as though he were following a blueprint only he could see. The sun hammered down on the planet, but he ignored the growing heat, absorbed in the patterns forming in his mind. Behind him, distant voices rose in frustration. The Avarian male accused the instructors of sabotage. Sira questioned whether a rescue signal would ever be detected. Another cadet muttered desperately about hiding underground, even though the ground was too solid to penetrate. Their panic floated across the wasteland like distorted echoes. Ethan did not turn back. He knew that panic was the fastest path to death on any hostile world. Instead, he chose a flat section of the plain where a large shoulder blade-like bone lay half exposed. It was broad and slightly concave, smooth enough to serve as a base. He dug it out with his hands, clearing the sand until the entire plate was free. He set it upright and tested its stability. It stood firm, resisting the dry breeze, and he nodded with satisfaction. This could become a makeshift work surface. He arranged the bones and shell fragments around it, organizing them by length, weight, and function. While his hands worked, his mind sorted through old lessons from Earth, archaeological reconstructions, primitive tool-making studies, accounts of early settlers rebuilding technology from scraps after disasters. All those stories carried the same message. Survival depended on imagination more than on resources. That idea had always resonated with him more deeply than with the other cadets, and now it guided every movement of his hands. He picked up a slender bone with a sharpened end and pressed it against the shell plate, striking it with another bone until tiny flakes chipped away. The sound was crisp and promising. He repeated the action with deliberate patience, shaping the shell fragment into a rough blade. The work was slow, and the dry air stung his eyes, but he continued until the edge grew sharp enough to slice through thin fibers. To test the blade, he retrieved a dried tendon from a skeletal heap he had uncovered earlier. He pressed the blade against the fibrous surface and pulled. The tendon split with a satisfying snap. That one moment confirmed that he could now produce tools that allowed precise cutting. He could shape bones, process fibers, and carve supports. It was enough to begin building something that resembled order. With the tendon separated into long strands, he stretched them out in the sunlight. The heat of Vascore 4 tightened them almost instantly, turning them into strong cords. He threaded them through holes he drilled into bones using the pointed end of another fragment. The result was a simple but sturdy joint, primitive, but the first true construct created on the planet in who knew how long. As he worked, Sira watched from a distance. She stood uncertainly at the edge of the plain, her violet skin shimmering faintly under the sun. After several minutes, she took a hesitant step closer, her eyes fixed on the structure forming in Ethan's hands. She spoke softly, almost afraid to break the stillness of the moment. "How are you doing that?" she asked. Her voice carried both awe and confusion. Ethan did not pause his work. He secured another bone into the growing frame before responding. "I am using what the planet gives," he said quietly. "Everything on this ground had a purpose once. It can have a new one." Sira looked at the piles of bones and fragments with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. Her species regarded remains with sacred caution, but desperation pushed her closer. "You think this will help us survive?" she asked. He tightened another strand of sinew and stepped back, inspecting the emerging shape. It resembled a small bench or work scaffold, uneven but functional. "It is the beginning," he said. "Once we have tools, everything else becomes possible." Sira stared at him for several seconds as though trying to understand a language she had never heard. Finally, she took a deep breath and knelt beside him, touching one of the bones with trembling fingers. Her cultural instincts recoiled, but her survival instincts pushed her forward. She lifted a piece of shell and held it up to the light. "Show me how to shape this," she said. Ethan took the shard and guided her hands carefully. She watched intently as he demonstrated how to strike along the natural lines of stress. When she attempted it herself, the shard fractured exactly where she intended, producing a sharp, usable edge. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since landing on Vascore 4, she looked more curious than fearful. As they worked side by side, the pile of raw debris slowly transformed into categorized materials. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows across the half-built structure. The landscape had not changed, but the atmosphere shifted. The hopelessness that gripped the group minutes earlier now felt thinner, less absolute. Ethan continued assembling the small workbench, securing each bone with precise movements. The structure gained weight and stability, becoming the foundation for everything he planned next. It stood as a silent declaration that the planet's lifeless appearance was nothing more than a challenge to be answered. When he finally stepped back and wiped the dust from his hands, the workbench cast a clear silhouette against the fading light. It was imperfect, uneven, and primitive, yet it represented the first step toward reclaiming order from a broken world. Sira stared at it with a quiet sense of possibility. Ethan looked over the desolate plains again and felt a steady certainty settle inside him. This was only the beginning. The bones scattered across this wasteland were not remnants of failure. For him, they were blueprints waiting to be followed. The sun drifted lower as Ethan left the workbench behind, stepping toward the jagged ridge where he had spotted the first glint of buried refuse. Sira followed several paces behind him, hesitant, but determined now that she had seen what could be done with fragments the others had dismissed as useless. The air had grown hotter, almost metallic, as if the planet itself exhaled heat instead of air. Dust devils twisted lazily along the horizon. To Ethan, this harsh landscape no longer felt empty. It felt layered, concealed, waiting for someone willing to uncover its potential. He reached the ridge and knelt in the shadow it cast, brushing away the upper layer of dust. Immediately, he struck something harder than bone. He cleared more soil and uncovered a curved sheet of darkened polymer, cracked but flexible enough to hold shape. His hand moved faster as he realized what lay beneath the sand. He scraped away the debris with controlled swipes until a cluster of broken materials emerged. Shattered lenses, melted ration containers, fiber plastic strands twisted into hardened knots, broken mechanisms from abandoned drones, and thin metal wires so brittle they crumbled at a touch. Everything was damaged beyond traditional use, but each piece held a possibility in his mind. He leaned forward with the same attention an archaeologist might give a sacred site. Sira crouched beside him, wide-eyed. "What is all this?" she whispered. He lifted a cracked, translucent dome that used to be part of a drone's optical housing. It caught the sun and focused a beam onto the sand, making it smolder faintly. "Trash," he said calmly. "But trash is the first step of engineering." Sira frowned as if the idea defied her education. Ethan placed the dome aside and pulled out a panel of flexible packaging, faded and brittle but still holding integrity. He held it up to the light, imagining it fused into waterproof insulation. The ideas assembled in his mind faster than he could verbalize them. He set the packaging down gently and continued excavating. The next hour passed in concentrated silence. Ethan uncovered discarded pieces of synthetic mesh, a shard of reinforced glass still sharp at the edges, a collection of snapped metal prongs, and a half-melted food container shaped like a bowl. He worked like a man solving a puzzle only he could see. Every few discoveries he would pause, analyzing the shape, weight, melting point, and potential function of each fragment before adding it to one of the piles he organized on the ground. Cutting material, reflective surfaces, structural components, insulation, and potential fuel sources. Sira watched him with growing curiosity. She lifted a thin wire and examined it carefully. "What can this become?" she asked. Ethan scanned the wire and pointed to the half-melted container. "Use it as reinforcement. Twist it into a grid and embed it in melted plastic. It will strengthen whatever we build." Sira repeated his movements, laying the wire against the plastic, and for the first time a slight spark of confidence appeared in her expression. She understood that nothing around them was worthless. Every object had a second life waiting to be shaped. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a hot gust that rattled the fragments on the ground. Ethan stood and scanned the landscape. The temperature was rising quickly, too quickly. He recognized the pattern from survival archives. Vascore 4 had brief heat surges where the air spiked to dangerous levels. The cadets who remained unprepared would suffer. He had no intention of joining them. He gathered the dome-shaped lens and the reinforced glass shard, then knelt beside the ridge again. He dug a shallow trench, lined it with small bone fragments, and placed the brittle ration packaging at the bottom. The lens he positioned carefully above it, angling it to catch the sun. The concentrated beam hit the packaging, melting the edges into a gooey layer. The smell of heated polymer rose sharply. Sira shielded her face from the fumes. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making panels," Ethan said. "Once hardened, these will be waterproof and strong enough to keep heat out." Sira watched the panel take shape, her eyes following the slow spread of melted plastic that fused around the fragments he had laid as support. He allowed it to cool, then lifted it gently. It bent, but did not break. Exactly what he needed. Now he turned his attention to creating fire. Real, controlled heat. The air was hot, but not enough for crafting. He took the cracked, transparent lens again and searched for a focal point. The sun sharpened into a bright pin of light on the ground. He shifted the angle, testing how tight the beam could be. When the point of light sparked against a dry tendon, it smoldered, then ignited into a thin flame. Sira drew in a sharp breath. "Fire," she whispered. "You made fire with trash?" He nodded and fed the small flame with bone dust and shredded packaging. The fire strengthened, and he guided it into a pit lined with heat-resistant shells he had placed earlier. The shells absorbed the heat without cracking, and soon the pit glowed with a faint orange core. This would become his forge for shaping materials whose transformation required far more than sunlight. He lifted a brittle piece of metal from the debris pile and held it over the fire. The metal softened at the edges, not enough to mold, but enough to bend. He pressed it against a bone handle he had carved earlier and wrapped the softened metal around it. When the metal cooled, it hardened again, locking the bone into place. The result was a crude but effective composite tool. Across the ridge, the wind swept more dust into the air, carrying the distant voices of the cadets who still argued and panicked far from his improvised workshop. He wondered briefly whether they would eventually follow the trail he had created. If not, the planet would claim them. If yes, they would need what he had begun to build. Sira remained beside the fire, silent but focused. She handed him more fragments as he constructed additional tools. Bone handles reinforced with metal edges, scraping blades made from hardened shells, sharp points formed from fused plastic and bone dust. With each tool completed, the possibilities expanded. He could cut more precisely, carve deeper grooves, shape more stable supports, and create stronger structures. When the sun lowered further, casting long shadows across the ridge, Ethan stood and surveyed the growing collection of tools laid on the ground. The sight filled him with a quiet sense of purpose. This was not just survival. This was a seed of reconstruction, small but undeniable. He gathered several of the fused panels and walked toward the sheltered area beside the ridge. He positioned the panels together, overlapping them to create the outer layer of a shelter wall. He used tendon fibers as binding and bone stakes to anchor the structure into the hard ground. The wall took shape gradually, forming the first curved segment of what would become a functional dwelling. Sierra pressed her hand against the finished portion. The surface held firm, resisting her touch. "You are building a real shelter," she murmured. Ethan wiped the dust from his palms and stepped back, assessing the stability. "A shelter is the foundation," he said. "Once we have it, we can build more. Storage, a water cooling system, tools for shaping larger structures. This planet looks dead, but it is full of everything a civilization needs if someone knows where to look." The last light of the day caught the translucent panels and made them glow with a faint amber hue. The small flame in the pit still burned steadily, protected by the shells he had arranged around it. The workbench from earlier waited nearby, ready to support the next stages of construction. The beginnings of a settlement, primitive but undeniable, rose from what had seemed like worthless refuse only hours earlier. Ethan watched the horizon slowly darken and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. The planet had offered only trash and bones. But trash and bones were enough. He picked up another shard of polymer and mentally mapped the next steps. Tomorrow, the work would continue, and Vascore 4 would give him even more to shape. The night on Vascore 4 fell without warning, as if the sun had been pulled out of the sky rather than allowed to descend. Ethan felt the temperature plummet almost immediately. The dry heat that had pressed into his skin all day vanished, replaced by a sharp chill that cut through his clothing. The sudden cold forced him to act quickly. He fed the fire pit with more bone dust and slivers of hardened packaging until the flames rose in a steady glow, casting shadows across the ridge. Sierra remained close, her arms wrapped around her chest as she watched the flames flicker. Her species was adapted to humid environments with stable temperatures, and this planet's extreme shifts were already wearing her down. Ethan reached for the fused panels he had set aside earlier and positioned them around the fire pit, not too close to melt, but close enough to trap heat. He adjusted their angles, creating a semicircular barrier that shielded the fire from the wind. The structure took shape quickly, but every movement reminded him that he needed something more sophisticated than a simple heat shield. He needed a real workspace, a place where heat, airflow, and structural support came together in a controlled environment. He needed a workshop. He surveyed the area beneath the ridge, noting the natural dip in the terrain. It offered shelter from the wind and a foundation strong enough to hold weight. He knelt and pressed his hand to the ground, feeling the firmness beneath the top layer of dust. It was solid enough for construction. He stood and retrieved the longest bones he had collected earlier, placing them in a row beside the ridge. Their shapes already suggested a framework in his mind. Sierra stepped closer, still warming her hands near the fire. "You are building something again," she said in a quiet, strained voice. "A workshop," Ethan replied. "A place where the heat can be controlled." "For tools?" she asked. "For everything," he said simply. He planted the longest bones vertically in the ground, striking them into place with another heavy bone he used as a mallet. Each stake slid into the soil with resistance, but the dried tendons and bone fragments he had collected earlier served as reinforcement. He lashed the stakes together, creating a skeletal structure that curved inward toward the ridge. The frame resembled an ancient archway, primitive yet sturdy. Sierra watched him work, her breath creating faint fog in the cold night air. Once the frame stood on its own, Ethan layered the polymer panels across the bones, weaving them with fibers until they formed a dense barrier. He left an opening at the top to allow smoke to escape and gaps at the base for airflow. As the shelter took shape, the cold wind died at the entrance, replaced by warm currents rising from the fire pit. Sierra stepped inside, relief washing across her expression as the warmth enveloped her. Ethan crouched near the entrance and examined the heat distribution. The workshop needed more than shelter. It needed a forge. He moved slowly around the fire pit, arranging shell fragments to reflect the heat inward. He placed two flat pieces upright on either side of the flames, adjusting their angles until the inner surface glowed faintly under the rising heat. He used bone shards to anchor them in place. Then he created a pit within a pit, scooping out a shallow basin beside the main fire and lining it with polished bones. The shell reflectors directed heat into the basin, creating a concentrated hotspot. He fed the fire and watched the temperature rise. The glow within the smaller pit intensified. It was not enough to melt metal, but it was enough to harden and shape. He took a brittle metal shard from the pile of salvage and held it inside the inner pit with a bone tong he had crafted earlier. The shard reached a dull orange glow. He tapped it against a bone handle, shaping it into a cleaner curve. When it cooled, it held its new form. Sira stared at the transformed tool piece with wonder. "You have created a forge," she said, awe adding warmth to her voice. "A small one," Ethan corrected, "but enough for what we need." He returned to the pile of salvage and selected several more pieces, another metal shard, two broken glass fragments, and a long stretch of mesh fiber. He placed the mesh inside the forge to soften the edges and then wrapped it around a bone handle, securing it with heated polymer. The combination hardened as it cooled, forming a reinforced tool grip. He examined it carefully, testing the weight and stability. It was crude, but it was real. Sira moved to the side of the workshop, adjusting the panels as Ethan had shown her earlier. Her hands worked more confidently now. She lifted a rib-shaped bone and traced its natural curve with her fingers. "This could support the roof," she said. Ethan turned and assessed the bone. "Yes. Place it here." He guided her as she inserted the rib into a slot he had carved between two vertical stakes. It fit snugly, completing another segment of the arch. Together, they added more bones, sealing the gaps with melted packaging and tendon fibers until the structure grew taller, stronger, more cohesive. The workshop now stood firmly anchored to the ridge, its interior illuminated by firelight that painted the curved bone walls with warm amber tones. Ethan retrieved one of the translucent panels and held it near the entrance of the workshop. The surface caught the firelight and dispersed it across the interior like a lantern. He hung the panel from a tendon strand at the top of the arch, letting it dangle with a soft glow. Sira stepped back and gazed at the effect with quiet amazement. Even in this dead world, the workshop felt alive. Ethan returned to the forge and lifted a glass shard. He positioned it near the heat until the edges softened slightly. Using a shaped bone tool, he pressed the shard into a concave curve. Once cooled, it became a reflective surface. He angled it inside the workshop to direct firelight toward the back of the space, illuminating the workbench he had built earlier. Now the workshop had layered light, heat control, airflow, and structural strength. He felt a rare moment of satisfaction. He placed the newly shaped blade on the bench and turned toward the entrance. Outside the workshop, the darkness of Vascore 4 stretched far across the barren plains. The pale twin moons hung above the horizon, casting faint silver outlines across the skeletal remains scattered in the distance. The cold wind tore across the ground, sweeping dust and bone fragments. He was grateful the workshop stood between him and that deadly chill. Despite the late hour, he returned to the salvage pile and selected a handful of shards. He brought them inside and spread them across the workbench. Sira watched him silently, sensing his focus. He took a flat piece of synthetic material and held it over the forge long enough to soften. Then he bent it into a curved container shape and reinforced the edges with bone strips. The result resembled a small scoop or ladle, and he placed it among the tools with a nod of approval. "Why make that?" Sira asked. "For water," he answered. "When we find it." The certainty in his tone startled her. She looked toward the distant plains, her voice softening. "Do you believe we will?" Ethan placed the ladle down and wiped the soot from his hands. "Water exists here," he said. "A world that once supported life leaves traces. We will find them." Sira lowered her gaze. She wanted to believe him, and his calm confidence made it easier. Ethan turned to the fire pit again and added another handful of bone dust. The flames surged, illuminating the workshop's curved frame. Shadows danced across the walls, giving the structure a sense of movement, as if it breathed with them. The workshop felt less like a primitive shelter and more like a place of purpose, a heartbeat of civilization in a world that no longer remembered how to support life. He stepped back and observed everything he and Sira had built. The tools lay neatly organized. The forge burned steadily. The shelter held firm against the wind. The air inside was warm enough to sleep without freezing. The faint glow of the suspended panel created a soft ambiance. This was no longer just a survival structure. It was the first workshop of Vascore 4, born from bone, polymer, shards, and determination. As the night deepened, Ethan finally allowed himself to sit near the fire, resting his back against the bone wall. Exhaustion pressed on his limbs, but satisfaction kept his mind alert. Sira settled beside him, her posture more relaxed than he had seen since the moment they had landed. She studied him with quiet curiosity. "You rebuild worlds," she said, her voice almost a whisper. He did not smile, but a subtle warmth entered his expression. "Someone must." The forge crackled softly, the flames reflecting in the curved glass surfaces. Outside, the desolate plains remained silent, unaware that within this small circle of warmth, the first spark of civilization had returned to Vascore 4. The first pale light of dawn crept across Vascore 4 like a hesitant promise, brushing the ridge and the curved bones of the workshop with muted gold. Ethan had slept little. He rose before the sky brightened, stepping out of the shelter to study the plains beyond the ridge. The cold stung his skin, but he barely noticed it. His thoughts had sharpened overnight. The workshop marked a beginning, but he understood that beginnings meant nothing without a plan that could endure past one night. If he wanted the cadets to survive, he needed to build beyond the walls of the shelter. He needed to create a functioning system. The air was still, untouched by the winds that usually swept across the planet. He scanned the horizon and let his gaze settle on the shallow depressions he had noticed earlier. The arrangement had intrigued him before, but now it struck him with clarity. He walked toward the nearest depression, brushing aside the dust until the pattern beneath emerged fully. The impressions were circular, unevenly spaced, and large enough to indicate the presence of once moving animals. But more importantly, he noticed something new. Thin mineral traces embedded in the soil. He pressed his fingers into the dirt, then lifted his hand to his face. The texture was slightly different, cooler, finer, almost moist. He dug deeper and found the soil denser beneath the top layer. Moisture held in the ground below the surface meant something essential. Water had passed here recently, carried by the planet's nocturnal condensation cycle. That was the missing piece. Ethan's pulse quickened. If he could create a system to trap moisture instead of letting it evaporate with the rising sun, the cadets could have drinking water within hours. He hurried back to the workshop and surveyed the materials he had collected. Sira emerged behind him, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You are planning something," she said, her voice hoarse from the chill. "I found a moisture vein," Ethan replied. "We can trap it." Sira blinked in confusion. "How?" He pointed to the polymer sheets he had fused and the curved glass shard he had shaped. "Condensation collectors." Together they gathered the panels and walked to the shallow depression. Ethan instructed Sira to help him shape the ground into a smooth basin. Once the surface was prepared, he placed the translucent lens above it at an angle, using bones as supports. Then he anchored the polymer sheets around the depression to prevent moisture from escaping. The lens would focus the early light and trigger a temperature shift inside the basin. The planet's cold night had saturated the ground just enough for the technique to work. Sira held the final bone support steady while Ethan secured it with tendon fibers. She watched the setup with growing hope. "Will this truly produce water?" she asked. "It will," he said with quiet certainty. Not much at first, but enough. Sira stepped back and stared at the collector as if witnessing an impossible transformation. Her species relied on advanced atmospheric tech for hydration, and seeing the concept recreated through bones and trash unsettled her understanding of what was possible. She moved closer to Ethan, her voice softening. "You always know what to do." "No," he answered, adjusting the lens with a final precise motion. "I only know that giving up is not an option." As the sun began to rise, faint droplets appeared on the underside of the translucent material. The moisture collected slowly, gathering in small rivulets that trickled into the basin below. Sira inhaled sharply as the droplets formed into a small pool. It was clear, thin, but unmistakably water. Relief washed across her face, and she knelt near the basin, touching the cool surface with reverence. Ethan did not pause. He headed toward another part of the ridge, where he had noticed a cluster of abandoned drone fragments the previous day. He gathered the remaining pieces and brought them back to the workshop. With the fire now burning steadily, he heated a piece of metal wire, bending it into a hook, while Sira constructed bone frames behind him. The two worked in synchronized silence, each movement intentional. The workshop had become their rhythm, and the planet no longer felt hostile in the same uncontrollable way. It felt solvable. By midday, the condensation collector held enough water to fill the small ladle Ethan had shaped earlier. He lifted it carefully and offered it to Sira. She hesitated for a moment, then drank slowly. The water was warm but clean, and her entire posture changed. She handed the ladle back to him with trembling hands. "This means we can survive," she whispered. "It means we can build," he corrected. He stood and looked across the plains. The cadets remained scattered far away, huddled and disoriented. He had avoided them intentionally until this moment. He needed a foundation before bringing them into the structure of what he envisioned. Now, with fire, shelter, tools, and water in place, he felt ready. He lifted a reflective shard and positioned it outside the workshop, angled to catch sunlight and send it toward the flats where the cadets had stayed. The bright flash cut through the air, impossible to ignore. Within minutes, the first cadet appeared on the ridge, then another, then several more. Soon, a small crowd gathered, exhausted, frightened, and desperate. The Avarian male stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "You built this," he said, staring at the workshop as if it were a hallucination made real. "How?" "With what the planet gave us," Ethan answered. Some cadets observed the workshop in silence. Others touched the bone supports with disbelief. A Zyran girl ran her hand along the heated shell reflectors, stunned by the stable warmth they provided. Ethan stepped past them and pointed to the condensation collector. "We have water now," he said. "More will form throughout the day." A quiet murmur passed through the group. Doubt gave way to awe to relief. Sira stood near the entrance, her posture confident, her eyes steady. The cadets began asking questions all at once, their voices rising in scattered confusion. Ethan raised his hand, and the noise quieted almost instantly. "We are building something larger than a shelter," he said. "This will become a functioning outpost. We will create storage. We will gather resources. We will make tools and systems. Vascore 4 has enough for all of us if we learn how to use it." For a moment, the plains were absolutely silent, as if the planet itself paused to listen. Then the cadets began moving. The Kraylock male helped Ethan retrieve more bones. The Zyran girl gathered polymer scraps. The Avarian male carried fragments of hardened shells to reinforce the forge. Sira guided two younger cadets to the condensation collector and taught them how to adjust it without destabilizing the structure. Within hours, the workshop expanded into a set of interconnected shelters, each one anchored to the ridge. As the sun lowered again, casting long shadows across the new camp, Ethan stood at the top of the ridge and observed everything they had built. The fire glowed warm under the arched bone frames. The collectors hummed softly as droplets formed and fell. The cadets worked with focused determination, no longer frozen in fear. Order had replaced chaos, structure had replaced panic, and the first true settlement of Vascore 4 stood where nothing had existed before. When the instructors finally descended from the sky in their shuttle, expecting to find a group of exhausted cadets clinging to survival, they instead saw a functioning micro-settlement shaped from bones, shards, and determination. The metallic ramp lowered, and Commander Rethar stepped out, his expression hardening as he surveyed the scene. Ethan approached the front of the camp and held up a carved piece of bone. The instructors paused as they read the message etched into the surface. Tools are not objects. Tools are ideas. Syrah stood behind him, her gaze steady and proud. The other cadets lined the ridge, each one transformed by what they had accomplished. Commander Rethar exhaled slowly, the rigid line of his jaw breaking as understanding settled over him. He looked at the settlement again, then at Ethan. "You rebuilt civilization," he said. Ethan shook his head. "We only started it." The wind shifted gently, brushing across the newly formed structures. The fire crackled. The condensation collectors glistened in the fading light. And for the first time since the planet had consumed the last of its original life, Vascore 4 felt alive again. The exam ended, but the lesson remained, etched in bone, built from trash, carried in the minds of every cadet who had witnessed how a human could turn nothing into a new beginning.